The year is 87 BC. The air over Rome is thick, heavy, saturated with the smell of fear and the dust of 1,000 marching feet. At the Colline gate stands an old man. He is 70. His face is a parchment on which fate has written a brutal chronicle. Deep wrinkles, like scars of humiliation. Eyes faded by the African sun, yet burning with the cold, unquenchable fire of revenge. This is Gaius Marius, a man elected consul 7 times to save this very city. A man once called the third founder of Rome, placed alongside the mythical Romulus. Now he looks upon the eternal city not as a savior, but as a wolf eyes a sheepfold. Behind him, an army, a rabble of loyal veterans, embittered Italians and slaves promised freedom for their master's blood. Inside the walls, a trembling Senate sends delegation after delegation, begging for mercy. They see not a hero, but a demon returned from the underworld they cast him into. How did this happen? How did the man synonymous with Rome's salvation become its greatest terror? Why did the one who 7 times turned the enemy's sword from the Republic's throat now raise the executioner's axe against it? This question is not just a historical riddle. It is a tragedy of power, ambition, and the depths to which a man can fall, convinced of his own righteousness and his own grievance. To find the answer, we must go back to a time when Rome did not yet know what kind of savior it was nurturing and what kind of monster it was creating. To understand the birth of such a titan, we must descend into the heart of that era. Rome in the latter half of the 2nd century BC. The Republic, that old wolf that had conquered the Mediterranean, was sick from within. Its body was bloated with conquest, but its soul was poisoned by social inequality. The victories in the Punic Wars and the conquest of Greece brought untold wealth, but it flowed into the hands of a narrow circle of senatorial aristocracy, the Optimates. They bought up land across Italy, creating giant estates, the latifundia, worked by slaves captured in countless wars. But the man who was the backbone of Rome, the free farmer, the citizen legionary, returned from campaigns to find his farm ruined. He was forced to sell it for pennies to the same aristocrats, joining the ranks of the landless, impoverished, and bitter proletariat in Rome itself. This city, the capital of the world, had become a boiling cauldron where the luxury of the few existed alongside the despair of millions. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, tried to pass land reforms to return the land to the people, but both were brutally murdered by the aristocratic party. Their deaths left a deep wound in the body of the Republic, proving that violence had become a legitimate political tool. The Senate, once a wise governing body, had devolved into a closed club of corrupt oligarchs, concerned only with preserving their privileges. It was into this world, full of cracks and hidden hatred, a world where the old traditions, the mos maiorum, no longer worked, and new rules had not yet been written, that Gaius Marius stepped. A man who had no intention of playing by the rules of this rotten world. He intended to break it. Gaius Marius was born in 157 BC in the small town of Arpinum, far from the glitter and intrigue of the capital. He was a homo novus, a new man. For the Roman aristocracy, this short Latin phrase was both a verdict and a brand. It meant that his family line had no consuls, no glorious ancestors whose wax masks adorned his home's atrium. He was an outsider, an upstart who dared to enter the sacred circle of Rome's hereditary rulers. To the patricians, whose names were etched into the Republic's history, a man like Marius was, at best, a tool, at worst, a threat to their world order. His entire life became a fierce, insatiable struggle against this original sin of his birth. He lacked refined manners. He had not studied Greek philosophy. His speech was rough, his character unyielding and harsh. But what he lacked in aristocratic polish, he compensated for with an iron will and boundless ambition. Plutarch reports that Marius was a severe man, showing no mercy to himself or others. He despised luxury and softness, seeing them as the cause of Rome's decline. This outsider complex, this constant feeling that he had to prove his right to exist tenfold more than any high-born heir, became the internal fire that consumed him and drove him forward. He didn't just want power, he craved recognition. He wanted to grind those who looked down on him into the dirt. Every achievement was not just a step up the career ladder, but a slap in the face to the entire senatorial class. And this burning resentment, this unquenchable thirst to prove that he, the hick from Arpinum, was worth 100 Cornelii and Fabii, would become the driving force behind his greatest achievements and his most monstrous crimes. Fate, it seemed, had marked this man from the beginning for great and terrible deeds. Ancient authors, particularly Plutarch, relay a legend that followed Marius like a shadow his entire life. It is said that in his youth, while walking his native lands near Arpinum, he stumbled upon an eagle's nest that had fallen from a high tree. Inside, he found 7 fledglings. In the pagan world, where every omen was read as a direct message from the gods, this could not be coincidence. The eagle was the bird of Jupiter, king of the gods and patron of Rome. To find an eagle's nest was already great fortune, but the number 7, a sacred, mystical number, transformed the event into an undeniable prophecy. The wise men and soothsayers, whom Marius supposedly consulted, interpreted the sign unequivocally. He was destined to become the greatest man in his state and to achieve supreme power 7 times. That is, to be elected consul 7 times. For a young man with no noble ancestors, such a prospect seemed insane. In the history of the Republic, no man had ever held the highest office 7 times. Even the greatest heroes were content with 2 or 3 consulships. But this prophecy, whether real or invented later to justify his rise, embedded itself deep in Marius's soul. It became his guiding star and his curse. It fed his ambition, gave him superhuman confidence in his own righteousness and his chosen status. He believed that fate itself was guiding him, and therefore any means to an end was justified. This prophecy turned his political career into a sacred mission. And when, decades later, he would be an old man, an exile sitting on the ruins of Carthage, it would be this faith in this omen that his 7th consulship was still to come, that would keep him from breaking and drive him back to Rome to take what was his, even if it meant drowning the city in blood. A character capable of both saving and destroying is not born in a vacuum. It is forged in the fire of harsh trials. For Gaius Marius, that forge was the Numantian War in Spain, where he went to serve in 134 BC. He fell under the command of one of the most severe and respected generals of the time, Scipio Aemilianus, the destroyer of Carthage. The army Scipio inherited was decadent, soft, and undisciplined. Instead of warriors, he found a mob followed by merchants, prostitutes, and fortune-tellers. Scipio began with the harshest measures. He expelled all outsiders from the camp, banned all comforts, and forced the soldiers to sleep on the bare ground and eat simple food. In this severe environment, the young Marius felt right at home. While the noble youths grumbled, he enthusiastically carried out every order, sharing all hardships with the common soldiers. He personally dug trenches, stood watch, and ate the same meager rations. He shunned no dirty work, demonstrating incredible endurance and strength. Scipio quickly noticed this diligent and grim young man who did not talk, but acted. Marius proved himself not only as a dutiful soldier, but as a brave warrior, distinguishing himself in several skirmishes and killing an enemy chieftain in single combat before the entire army. It was there, in the trenches outside Numantia, that he absorbed the three main lessons of his life. First, he learned that the true strength of an army lies in iron discipline and hardship, not in the noble birth of its commanders. Second, he earned the respect of the common soldiers, who saw him as one of their own, not just another aristocrat. And third, he solidified his contempt for the soft Roman nobility, whom he believed were incapable of either fighting or governing. Numantia was his university, where he earned his warrior's diploma and learned that the world is ruled not by lineage, but by will and the sword. Returning to Rome with the reputation of a hero from Numantia and glowing recommendations from Scipio himself, Marius began his difficult climb up the cursus honorum, the ladder of Roman offices. Every step was a battle, as the senatorial aristocrats grudgingly allowed a new man to rise. In 119 BC, he was elected tribune of the plebs, a position traditionally seen as the defender of the common people. And Marius used this platform to launch his first open strike against the senatorial oligarchy. He proposed a new voting law designed to limit the ability of the wealthy to pressure voters. The bridges voters walked across were to be made narrower, so aristocrats could not look over and control the citizens' choices. The Senate, naturally, was furious. Consul Cotta opposed the law and summoned Marius to explain himself. A scene unfolded that stunned all of Rome. Instead of humbly apologizing, Marius, this upstart from the provinces, not only refused to withdraw his law, but threatened the consul with arrest. When the other consul, Metellus, supported his colleague Marius without batting an eye, ordered his lictors to take him to prison as well. The two highest officials of the Republic were threatened with arrest by a defiant tribune. The senators were in shock at such audacity and not wanting an escalation. They backed down. The law was passed. This episode became a defining moment for his entire career. It showed that Marius feared no authority and was willing to charge ahead, breaking unwritten rules and traditions if they stood in his way. He positioned himself as a defender of the people against a corrupt nobility, winning popularity among the masses and the mortal hatred of the Senate. This was his first declaration of war on the system. Behind every great man stands not only a great idea, but a deeply personal, often hidden motivation. For Gaius Marius, this driving force, his inner demon, was the all-consuming complex of the new man. This was not just a political stance. It was an existential wound that never healed. He could be richer than any patrician, more talented than any general from an ancient family, but he always knew that in their eyes, he would remain the hick from Arpinum. This resentment turned into an insatiable hunger for glory. Not just success, but total, undeniable triumph that would force the entire aristocracy to kneel before him. He didn't just want to join their club. He wanted to destroy it and build a new one, where the only measure of a man was his valor and his merit, not the names of his ancestors. His marriage to Julia, the aunt of the future Julius Caesar, was a brilliant political move. He married into one of the oldest, though impoverished, patrician families, gaining access to high society. But even this did not satisfy his hunger. He saw the contempt in their polite smiles, felt the condescension in their patronizing gestures. So he sought glory where lineage didn't matter, on the battlefield. War was, for him, the only honest environment where courage and talent were valued above a family tree. Every victory, every triumph, was not just service to Rome, but an act of personal revenge. He was proving to them all that he, the man from nowhere, was better than them. This obsession with recognition and glory made him a great general, but it also destroyed him. In times of peace, when his political talents proved negligible, he felt useless. When glory went to others, especially aristocrats like Sulla, it drove him mad. His inner demon demanded constant fuel, new wars, new victories, new honors. And when the Republic could not give him that, he did not hesitate to take it by force, plunging it into civil war. The real springboard for Marius's rise, the stage where he could fully demonstrate his military genius and simultaneously plant a time bomb at the foundation of the Republic, was the Jugurthine War in Numidia, which began in 111 BC. The Numidian king Jugurtha, a cunning and ruthless ruler, had started the war, and according to the historian Sallust, was easily bribing Roman senators and generals, turning the war into a shameful farce. The Roman army suffered one humiliating defeat after another. Finally, command was given to Quintus Caecilius Metellus, a member of one of the most noble families, an honest but slow aristocrat. He took Gaius Marius as his legate, or senior deputy. Marius, proving himself a brilliant and energetic commander, quickly won popularity among the soldiers. But he craved more. Seeing Metellus's indecision, he began to secretly agitate against him, spreading rumors that Metellus was deliberately dragging out the war. He convinced Roman merchants in Africa and soldiers to write letters to Rome, demanding Marius be given command. He then asked Metellus for leave to go to Rome to run for consul. Metellus, with aristocratic arrogance, replied, "Can't you wait and be consul with my son?" A biting insult, as Metellus's son was only 20, and Marius would have to wait decades. This remark was the last straw. Receiving permission at the very last moment, he rushed to Rome and launched a fiery populist campaign, promising to end the war quickly and capture Jugurtha. The people, tired of the nobility's corruption and failure, elected him consul for 107 BC. Against the Senate's wishes, the popular assembly gave him command in Numidia. It was in preparing for this war that Marius enacted his fateful military reform. For the first time in Roman history, he began recruiting the capite censi, the head count, the proletarians, citizens who had nothing but their lives to offer. Before, the army was a militia of property owners. Now it became professional. These new soldiers served not out of duty, but for pay and a share of the spoils. Their loyalty belonged not to the faceless Senate, but to the general who led them to victory and wealth. Marius had created an army that would become his personal instrument, and this precedent would change Rome forever. By creating this new type of army, Marius didn't just gain an effective tool for war. He fundamentally altered the entire political structure of the Roman Republic, without fully realizing it. Before him, a legionary was a citizen farmer who returned to his land after a campaign. His loyalty was to the state, to the Republic, which he defended as his own property. Marius's new legionaries were professional soldiers, for whom war was their only craft and livelihood. They had no farms to return to. Their future, their pension, their plot of land at retirement depended entirely on their general. It was the general who had to push laws through the Senate to grant land to his veterans. and the Senate, hostile to popular generals like Marius, often resisted. As a result, an unbreakable bond formed between the soldiers and their commander. They were willing to follow him anywhere, even against Rome itself, if he promised them a reward. The army ceased to be the army of the Republic. It became the personal clientele of a general. Marius was the first to create this dangerous instrument, and he would also be the first to suffer from it, when his rival Sulla used his army to march on Rome. But in the long run, the consequences were even more catastrophic. The entire subsequent history of the Republic's fall is the story of powerful proconsuls: Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, each commanding a personal army loyal only to him. Marius, seeking to solve the short-term problem of recruitment in Africa and gain support from the poor, had opened Pandora's box. He gave a sword to men with nothing to lose and bound their loyalty to ambitious leaders. He turned the army from the state's protector into the main factor in domestic politics, the ultimate tool for seizing power. In saving Rome from Jugurtha, he had injected a slow-acting poison into its body, one that would kill the Republic within a few decades. While Marius was busy in Africa, a storm of unprecedented fury was gathering over Rome from the north, making the Numidian War seem like a minor nuisance. Two massive Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones, along with others, began moving south from the Jutland Peninsula, fleeing either famine or flood. This was not an army. It was a migration of entire peoples, hundreds of thousands of warriors, women, and children moving on their creaking carts, sweeping away everything in their path. For Rome, accustomed to organized armies, this was a force of nature, like an avalanche or a wildfire. The Germans were tall, fair-haired giants whose savage appearance and battle fury struck panic into the disciplined but smaller Roman legions. At first, the Senate treated the threat with contempt, but then came a series of catastrophic defeats. In 113 BC at Neraea, in 109 at Silanus, in 107, the consul Lucius Cassius was defeated and killed in Gaul. But the most terrible blow came on October 6, 105 BC. At the Battle of Arausio, modern-day Orange in France, two Roman armies, led by inept and feuding aristocrats, were almost completely annihilated. Ancient historians report the loss of 80,000 legionaries and another 40,000 camp followers. It was the worst defeat since Cannae. Italy was left defenseless against the barbarian invasion. Panic reigned in Rome, comparable to the terror after the Gallic invasion 3 centuries earlier. Everyone understood that the aristocracy, mired in infighting and incompetence, could not save the state. And so all eyes turned to one man, Gaius Marius, who, having just finished the war in Africa, was returning to Rome. The people, bypassing all laws and traditions, elected him consul in absentia for 104 BC, then for 103, 102, 101, 5 times in a row. This was unheard of. It violated the very foundations of the Republic, which was designed precisely to prevent the concentration of power in one man's hands. But fear was stronger than law. Rome was voluntarily surrendering itself to a dictator, begging him for salvation. In this deadly drama, 2 figures step into the spotlight, whose collision will define the Republic's fate for decades. The first was Quintus Sertorius, a Sabine by origin, a man of incredible courage and talent, who would become one of Marius's most loyal and capable legates. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, a man who knew how to connect with conquered tribes. His devotion to Marius was total, and he would fight for his cause even after his patron's death, creating an independent state in Spain and terrifying Roman generals. But if Sertorius was Marius's right hand, his shadow, his eternal curse, was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. An aristocrat from an ancient but impoverished family, Sulla was Marius's complete opposite. He was educated, loved luxury, theater, and the company of women and wine. But behind this mask of a bon vivant hid a cold, calculating, and ruthless mind, as well as immense military ambition. Fate brought them together in Numidia, where Sulla served as Marius's quaestor. It was Sulla, through diplomatic cunning, who managed to convince Jugurtha's father-in-law to betray the king to the Romans. Jugurtha's capture effectively ended the war, but instead of giving the glory to his commander, Sulla began to emphasize his own role in the success. He even commissioned a ring depicting the handover of Jugurtha, which he wore constantly, stinging Marius's pride. For Marius, this was a betrayal and an insult. He, who had won the war, was being overshadowed by his aristocratic subordinate. This spark of hatred, ignited in the African sands, would flare into a fire that would burn the entire republic. Marius saw in Sulla the embodiment of everything he despised: aristocratic arrogance, unearned glory, and treachery. Sulla, in turn, saw Marius as a crude upstart, a tyrant who trampled the law. Their personal animosity, layered on top of the social conflict between populares and optimates, created an explosive mixture, waiting only for a spark to detonate. Having received dictatorial powers and an army reformed to his own design, Marius did not wait for the barbarians in Italy. He moved to meet them in Gaul. For several years, he trained and hardened his soldiers, avoiding a decisive battle, acclimating them to the sight and fury of the Germans. Meanwhile, the barbarians split. The Teutones and Ambrones moved toward Italy along the coast, while the Cimbri aimed for the Alps. In 102 BC, near the town of Aquae Sextiae, modern-day Aix-en-Provence, Marius's army met the Teutones. Marius took a superior position on a hill, cutting off the barbarians' access to water. Tormented by thirst, the Teutones were forced to attack the Roman fortifications under unfavorable conditions. The battle, according to Plutarch, was incredibly fierce. First, the Ligurian allies of the Romans entered the fight. Their battle cries similar to those of the Ambrones, which caused confusion. Then the legions charged. Marius had hidden a 3,000-man detachment under Claudius Marcellus in a nearby wood, which, at the decisive moment, struck the barbarians from the rear. This sealed the battle's outcome. A slaughter began. The Romans, enraged by stories of the Germans' cruelty, took no prisoners. Sources report 100,000 barbarians killed or captured. The valley was littered with bodies, and the fertility of the soil in that region, according to legend, was long attributed to the fertilizer from the bones of the fallen. As Marius prepared to make a triumphal sacrifice, burning the captured weapons, a messenger galloped in from Rome. He had been elected consul for a 5th time. The first great salvation was complete. Rome was delivered from half the threat. The legend of Marius the Savior began to take on flesh and blood, and the people's gratitude knew no bounds. He had become a living god, civilization's only hope against barbarism. While Marius was triumphantly dealing with the Teutones in Gaul, the second barbarian horde, the Cimbri, began their descent into Italy through the Alpine passes. The army meant to stop them was commanded by the other consul, Quintus Lutatius Catulus, an aristocrat more famous for his education than his military talent. Catulus's legions could not withstand the sight and fury of the giant barbarians, who, according to stories, slid down the snowy slopes on their shields as if on sleds. The Romans fled in panic, leaving all of northern Italy to be plundered. News of this reached Marius. He united his victorious army with the remnants of Catullus's troops and moved to face the final threat. The decisive battle took place on July 30th, 101 BC, on the fields of Vercellae in the Po Valley. Marius again demonstrated his tactical genius. He positioned his troops so that the bright summer sun and wind blew dust straight into the Cimbri's faces. The Cimbri, having formed their infantry into a massive square, had tied themselves together with ropes to make their line unbreakable. This tactic ultimately backfired, turning them into a shackled, unwieldy mass. The Roman cavalry outflanked them, and Marius's hardened, disciplined legions began to methodically annihilate the enemy. The dust and sun blinded the barbarians, and the heat quickly exhausted them, accustomed as they were to a northern climate. The rout was total. Over 120,000 Cimbri were killed, and 60,000 were taken captive. The Cimbri women, seeing their husbands' defeat, killed their children and then themselves to avoid falling into slavery. The threat that had held Rome in fear for over a decade was finally eliminated. When news of the victory reached Rome, the adulation was boundless. Marius was given a magnificent triumph, and the people, in their adoration, proclaimed him the third founder of Rome, placing him alongside Romulus and Camillus. He had reached the pinnacle of glory, a height a new man could never have dreamed of. He had become a living deity, the savior of the fatherland. And it was at this moment of absolute triumph that the seeds of the future tyrant began to sprout in his soul. The year is 101 BC. Marius is at the zenith of his glory. He is the savior of Rome, its shield and sword. A grateful people elects him consul for a sixth time, now in peacetime. And then something happens that often befalls great warriors. The man born for war finds himself completely helpless and clumsy in the world of politics. On the battlefield, everything was simple. There was an enemy, there were legions, there was victory. In the Senate, different rules applied. Intrigue, alliances, rhetoric, compromise. Marius, with his rough soldier's temperament, despised it all. He didn't know how, and didn't want, to negotiate. Trying to secure the promised land for his veterans, he met fierce resistance from the Senate. Desperate for political support, he made a fatal mistake. He formed an alliance with the two most radical demagogues of the time, the tribune Lucius Appuleius Saturninus and the praetor Gaius Servilius Glaucia. This pair was capable of anything for power: bribery, intimidation, even political assassination. Using Marius's veterans as a strong-arm squad, they began ramming their laws through the popular assembly, beating and chasing off their opponents. Rome plunged into chaos. The streets became battlegrounds between factions. Marius got the land for his veterans, but the price was too high. He found himself completely dependent on his radical allies, who grew increasingly brazen and uncontrollable. He, the great general, looked like a puppet in the hands of street thugs. This was the peak of his power, and simultaneously, the moment of his greatest hubris. He believed his achievements gave him the right to stand above the law and tradition, but instead, he became a hostage to the very dark forces he had unleashed. His authority began to plummet, both in the eyes of the Senate, which hated him even more, and the people who were tired of the violence. The political crisis sparked by Marius's alliance with Saturninus and Glaucia reached its climax during the elections for 99 BC. When one of the consular candidates, Gaius Marius, was murdered in the Forum by Saturninus's gangs, the Senate's patience snapped. The senators issued a senatus consultum ultimum, an emergency decree, effectively declaring martial law and granting the consuls dictatorial powers to save the Republic. And the consul that year was Gaius Marius. Fate had played a cruel joke. The man who relied on the people and hated the Senate was now ordered by that same Senate to suppress his own populist allies. Marius was trapped. To support Saturninus meant breaking with the law completely and becoming a rebel. To oppose him meant betraying those who had helped him secure land for his veterans and losing his popular support base. After some hesitation, Marius chose the law. As consul, he was obligated to restore order. He armed his supporters, and after a fierce street battle, cornered Saturninus, Glaucia, and their followers on the Capitoline Hill. To force their surrender, he cut off the water supply. Left without water, the rebels capitulated on Marius's personal promise that they would not be executed without a trial. Marius locked them in the Senate house, trying to save them from summary justice. But the enraged mob of aristocrats and their supporters did not want justice. They climbed onto the roof, tore it apart, and pelted the prisoners with tiles until they were dead. Marius was unable or unwilling to stop them. That day was a catastrophe for him. He had followed the Senate's order but received no gratitude. The aristocrats still saw him as a dangerous upstart. At the same time, he lost the trust of the people, who saw him as a traitor. He found himself in complete political isolation. His glory as Rome's savior had faded. For several years, he was forced to retreat into the shadows, undertaking a long journey to the east. The first cracks had appeared in the monolith of his greatness. After several years in obscurity, a new storm gave the aging Marius a chance to return to the great game. In 91 BC, the social war erupted, one of the most bloody and tragic events in Roman history. The Italian allies, who had fought alongside the Romans for centuries, shedding their blood for the Republic's greatness, demanded full Roman citizenship and all its rights. The Senate arrogantly refused. In response, all of central and southern Italy took up arms. This was not a war against a foreign enemy, but against themselves. The Italians were trained and armed just like the Romans. They knew their tactics. The war was incredibly fierce. Rome was on the brink of disaster. In this critical moment, the Republic once again called on its best generals, among them Gaius Marius. He accepted a command, and despite his age, operated successfully, winning several important victories. But something had changed. He was no longer the energetic and decisive commander of the Cimbric Wars. He acted cautiously, slowly. And right beside him, his eternal rival, the young and energetic Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was shining. It was Sulla who won the most resounding victories, Sulla who showed the initiative and ruthlessness required in this war. The glory that Marius considered his by right was slipping away from him and passing to his mortal enemy. While Marius received modest praise, Sulla was elected consul for 88 BC. For Marius, this was an unbearable humiliation. He, the savior of Rome, was being overshadowed by an aristocratic upstart. The inner demon, his inferiority complex and thirst for glory, awoke once more. He saw his legacy being erased, his place in history taken by the hated Sulla. And as the war with the Italians neared its end, a new, even more glorious and profitable war was looming on the horizon. The war in the east against Mithridates, king of Pontus. Command of this war was the most coveted prize in Rome, and Marius decided that it must belong to him, and him alone, at any cost. The war against Mithridates VI Eupator, king of Pontus, promised not only untold spoils but eternal glory. Mithridates, a sworn enemy of Rome, had seized the Roman province of Asia and orchestrated a horrific massacre, slaughtering, by various estimates, between 80,000 and 150,000 Romans and Italians in a single day. Rome's response had to be swift and devastating. By law and tradition, command in a new war went to one of the serving consuls, and the consul for 88 BC was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The Senate, which had always supported Sulla and hated Marius, unhesitatingly gave him this prestigious mission. For the 69-year-old Marius, this was tantamount to a death sentence for his ambitions. He was being pushed to the margins of history, doomed to a thankless old age while his enemy covered himself in glory in the East. His inner demon roared with rage and humiliation, and Marius made the fatal move that finally pushed the Republic into the abyss of civil war. He formed an alliance with the ambitious and unprincipled tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus. Sulpicius, surrounded by a crowd of armed supporters he called his anti-Senate, began introducing laws in the popular assembly that favored Marius. The most important was the law transferring command of the Mithridatic War from Sulla to Marius. This was a direct and brazen violation of all constitutional norms. Sulla and his consular colleague tried to protest, but riots broke out in the forum. Sulpicius's supporters attacked the consuls, the son of one was killed, and Sulla himself was forced to flee and seek refuge in Marius's house. Paradoxically, Marius saved him from the mob, not out of mercy, but so he wouldn't interfere with the law's passage. In the end, under the threat of violence, the law was passed. Marius got what he wanted. By force, relying on a street mob, he had stripped a legal commander of his army. He thought he had won, but he failed to consider one thing. Sulla was not the man to tolerate such humiliation. Having stripped Sulla of his command, Marius sent his officers to the town of Nola, where the army was preparing to march east to take command. He was sure the soldiers, many of them his veterans, would gladly defect to his side, but he had miscalculated. Sulla arrived at the camp first and addressed his legionaries. He painted the situation in stark terms. Marius had not only illegally seized power, but would likely raise a new army for the east, while they, already prepared for the campaign and anticipating rich plunder, would be sent home. The argument was simple and irresistible. For professional soldiers whose livelihood depended on war, this meant losing everything. When Marius's officers arrived, the legionaries stoned them to death. And then, the unthinkable happened, an event that became the point of no return for the Roman Republic. Sulla, seeing his soldiers' loyalty, called on them to march on Rome, to liberate it from tyrants. In all of Rome's centuries-long history, no general had ever dared to lead Roman legions against Rome itself. It was the ultimate sacrilege, a violation of sacred law, the mos maiorum. The army existed to protect the city, not attack it. Nearly all of Sulla's officers, save one, refused to take part in this blasphemy and deserted him. But the common legionaries, for whom loyalty to their general and the thirst for loot were more important than ancient traditions, supported him. 6 legions, 35,000 men, marched up the Appian Way toward the Eternal City. Marius and Sulpicius, caught completely off guard, tried to organize a defense, arming gladiators and slaves, but their militia was swept aside by Sulla's professional army. For the first time in its history, Rome was taken by storm, by its own army. The precedent Marius had set, using force to solve political disputes, had turned back on him with terrifying power. After capturing Rome, Sulla immediately annulled Sulpicius's laws and declared Gaius Marius, his son, and 10 of their allies, enemies of the state. This meant any Roman citizen could kill them with impunity and claim a reward. For Marius, the savior of Rome, this was the ultimate fall. His desperate and humiliating flight began. He scrambled across Italy, hounded by Sulla's trackers. He was forced to hide in forests, to starve, to sleep in the open. One of the most dramatic scenes of his escape, described by Plutarch, took place near the town of Minturnae. Trying to board a ship, he was captured and thrown into prison. The local authorities, not daring to openly execute such a great man, sent a hired killer, a Gaul by birth, into his cell. When the barbarian entered the dark room with a sword, he saw the old man's eyes burning in the darkness, and he heard a thunderous voice. "Man, do you dare to kill Gaius Marius?" The killer, struck with terror at the sight of the legendary general who had once crushed his people, fled the cell in a panic, screaming, "I cannot kill Gaius Marius!" The authorities of Minturnae, taking this as a divine omen, were shamed by their own cowardice. They released Marius and even provided him with a ship. This episode shows the incredible strength of will and authority the man still possessed. Even as a broken, humiliated fugitive, he was still Marius, the conqueror of the Cimbri and Teutones. But this was only a temporary reprieve. His odyssey, full of hardship and danger, was far from over. Every new humiliation only stoked the fire of hatred and vengeance in his soul, transforming him from a fallen hero into a future monster. After wandering Italy, Marius managed to reach Africa, the province where he had once won his first great victories in the Jugurthine War, and where he still had many supporters. He landed near Carthage. The provincial governor, fearing Sulla, immediately sent an officer to Marius demanding he leave Africa. Marius's reply, as recorded by Plutarch, became one of the most famous phrases of antiquity. The old man listened silently to the order, then said to the messenger, "Go tell your praetor that you have seen Gaius Marius, an exile, sitting on the ruins of Carthage." This sentence was filled with the deepest tragedy and symbolism. The greatest general of his time, the savior of Rome, sitting on the ruins of Rome's greatest enemy. One shattered giant contemplating another. In that moment, Marius probably felt a deep kinship with that fallen city. His own career, his glory, his life, all lay in ruins. He was broken, humiliated, stripped of everything. But Carthage had once been mighty, and so had Marius. And perhaps it was the sight of those ruins that kept him from surrendering, that strengthened his resolve. He did not want to end his life the same way. This image, the old, broken but unconquered Marius on the ruins of Carthage, became a symbol of unbending will and a prelude to his terrible future revival. He was not just mourning his fate, he was absorbing a rage and hatred that he believed gave him the right to any vengeance, no matter how bloody. The African exile was the final stage of his transformation. The hero was finally dead, replaced by a vengeful and ruthless demon. While Marius nurtured his hatred in Africa, the political situation in Rome shifted dramatically. Sulla, having restored order, had hurried east to fight Mithridates, leaving 2 consuls in power, Gnaeus Octavius, his supporter, and Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a man with populist leanings. As soon as Sulla sailed, Cinna immediately tried to repeal his laws and recall the exiles, including Marius. Armed conflict broke out between the consuls right in the streets of Rome. Octavius, backed by the Senate, gained the upper hand. Cinna was driven from the city, and his consular powers were annulled, an illegal act that drove another nail into the coffin of republican traditions. The exiled Cinna did not give up. He began touring the Italian towns that had recently received citizenship, raising an army and calling them to fight the senatorial oligarchy. It was then that he remembered that other powerful exile, Gaius Marius. He sent an invitation to him in Africa. For Marius, this was a gift from fate. He immediately answered the call. Two desperate men, one stripped of his consulship, the other declared an enemy of the state, formed an alliance. Marius, arriving at Cinna's camp, put on a full performance. He appeared in a dirty, torn toga, with uncut hair and beard, displaying his suffering for all to see. His appearance provoked pity and anger in the soldiers. He addressed them with a speech, and his words, full of pain and thirst for revenge, found a powerful echo. Veterans, remembering his former glory, enthusiastically welcomed their old commander. The alliance of the desperate was sealed. They had a common goal, to take Rome, and a common motivation, limitless hatred for their enemies in the Senate. Having gathered a significant force, Marius and Cinna began their march on Rome. Their army was a motley crew. There were the legions gathered by Cinna, the veterans who flocked to Marius, masses of Italians who hated the Roman Senate, and even slaves whom Marius had promised freedom. He used his legendary name to attract more and more supporters. This was no longer an army of the Republic. It was a personal army of avengers. They moved on Rome in several columns, cutting the city off from its supply routes. Marius, using his military expertise, seized Ostia, Rome's main port, and blocked the grain shipments up the Tiber. The Eternal City, which he had once saved from starvation during the barbarian invasion, was now condemned to starvation by his own hand. The defenders of Rome, led by Consul Octavius, were demoralized. Hunger, disease, and infighting began within the city. The Senate tried to call other generals for help, but they were either slow to respond or their soldiers refused to fight against Marius. The name of Rome's savior still held magical power. The demon the Republic had nurtured had returned to devour it. This march on Rome was the quintessence of Marius's tragedy. The man who was Rome's symbol of protection and salvation had now become its greatest enemy, using the same tactics against it as the city's most bitter foes. He was destroying what he himself had built. Psychologically, this was the final break with his past. The savior was dead. Only the executioner remained. The siege was short but agonizing. Hunger, disease, and fear broke the will of Rome's defenders. The Senate, seeing the situation was hopeless, sent ambassadors to Cinna to negotiate terms of surrender. Cinna received them, seated in his consul's chair, and promised there would be no mass slaughter. Beside him, silent, stood Marius, still wearing his ragged exile's toga. His silence was more terrifying than any threat. When the delegation asked him for his word, he did not utter a sound, but his grim stare and dark expression left no doubt as to his intentions. The city surrendered. Cinna entered Rome as the legal consul. Marius, however, pointedly refused to enter until the popular assembly officially annulled his status as an exile. He wanted to return not as a criminal, but as a hero who had been unjustly wronged. The assembly was hastily convened, and the law of exile was repealed. And then Marius, accompanied by his personal guard of slaves, known as the Bardiaci, entered the city. Rome froze in agony. A terror began, the likes of which the city had never seen. Cinna tried to restrain the violence, but he was no longer in control. The show was run by Marius, possessed by paranoia and a lust for revenge. He drew up prescription lists of his enemies to be destroyed. The hunt for human beings began. The Bardiaci burst into homes, killing, looting, and raping. Anyone whom Marius failed to greet in the street was immediately killed on the spot. What followed Marius's entry into Rome was not war or a political purge. It was a bacchanalia of vengeance, a pathological slaughter born of years of humiliation and stored-up hatred. Marius methodically and ruthlessly eliminated everyone he considered an enemy. His main targets were the optimate aristocrats who had once laughed at him and driven him into exile. The consul Gnaeus Octavius was murdered right in his curule chair. The greatest orator of the age, Marcus Antonius, grandfather of the famous Mark Antony, was betrayed and beheaded. Marius held his head in his hands during dinner. The heads of murdered senators were displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum, the very place where they had once given speeches defending the Republic. It was a gruesome symbol. Reason and law were dead, their place taken by severed heads. The terror lasted for 5 days and 5 nights. The bodies of the slain were thrown into the streets, forbidden to be buried. Their property was confiscated. Marius walked the city like a specter of death, and his silent nod or refusal to shake a hand was a death sentence. His slave guard, the Bardiaci, spun out of control and began killing indiscriminately for plunder, until Cinna and Sertorius, horrified by the chaos, surrounded their camp at night and slaughtered every last one of them. The paradox had reached its peak. The savior of Rome, the third founder, was personally overseeing the destruction of its elite, its senators, its most respected citizens. He wasn't just killing enemies. He was cutting out the brain and heart of the Republic. He drowned the very city he had sworn 7 times to protect in its own blood. This was not politics. This was madness, the final terrible convulsion of a wounded ego that, to prove its greatness, was willing to destroy the entire world. Having executed his revenge, Marius achieved the final goal of his life. He and Cinna, without any election, declared themselves consuls for the following year, 86 BC. For Marius, this was his 7th consulship. The prophecy of his youth had come true. He had reached the summit he had dreamed of all his life, proving to everyone that he was the greatest man in Rome. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. He sat on a throne built of corpses in a city paralyzed by terror. His triumph was his agony. Having completed his revenge, he seemed to lose his reason for living. Nightmares began to torment him. At night, he dreamed of the horrors he had committed. He was haunted by the ghost of Sulla, who he knew would sooner or later return from the east with his victorious army to take revenge. By day, he was grim and suspicious. By night, he tossed in a delirium, screaming that he was fighting Mithridates, the war that had been stolen from him and had caused his fall. His physical and mental health were completely shattered. Trying to drown the fear and the nightmares, he, according to Plutarch, began to drink heavily. On the 13th day of his 7th consulship, he fell ill with pleurisy. Just a few days later, on January 17th, 86 BC, at the age of 71, Gaius Marius died. His death was as contradictory as his life. He died not on the field of battle, covered in glory, but in his bed, tormented by fear, madness, and sickness. He had gotten everything he wanted. He had avenged his enemies and become consul 7 times. But the irony was that in achieving his goal, he had destroyed not only his enemies, but also himself. The end of his journey was not a triumph, but the tragic and pathetic disintegration of a personality that could not survive its own victory. The legacy of Gaius Marius proved to be as bloody and destructive as the final months of his life. He left behind a Rome split in 2, and a precedent that would become the norm for the Republic's final century. His terror gave birth to a responsive and even more horrific terror. A few years later, Sulla would return from the east, crush the Marians, and institute his own prescriptions, which would exceed everything Marius had done in scale and cruelty. He would destroy thousands of citizens, filling Rome with blood from the other side. But the main, long-term effect of Marius's actions lay in 2 things. First, his military reform. By creating a professional army loyal not to the state but to its general, he, as we've said, created the instrument that, in the hands of ambitious men like Caesar, Pompey, and Octavian, would ultimately destroy the republican system. He gave them the sword with which they would cut the republic's throat. Second, his march on Rome with Cinna, like Sulla's march before it, destroyed the ultimate taboo of Roman politics. He showed that the army could and should be used as a tool in internal political struggles. He legitimized civil war. After him, the path from a proconsulship in a province to a dictatorship in Rome was paved by loyal legions. Thus, Marius, without intending to, became one of the chief architects of the Roman Republic's fall. He tried to break the system that would not accept him, but in the end, he broke the state itself. He was a product of the Republic's crisis and, simultaneously, its catalyst. His story became a terrible lesson for future generations, showing how personal ambition, multiplied by military force, can destroy even the most powerful state from within. Now we can return to the central question, the central paradox. How did the Savior become the executioner? The answer is layered, like a geologic cross-section, where each layer is a separate cause. The first layer is personal, the burning complex of the new man, the eternal resentment toward an aristocracy that refused to see him as an equal. This resentment turned his thirst for glory into an obsession that demanded constant validation and tolerated no competition. The second layer is political. Marius was a genius of war, but a complete novice in politics. When he tried to play by the rules of Senate intrigue, he lost, forcing him to resort to the only tool he understood: brute force, relying first on the mob and then on the army. The third layer is institutional. His military reform, born of necessity, created a new type of army that became a personal weapon in the hands of generals. He himself created the force that destroyed Rome's political balance. The fourth layer is situational. Sulla's precedent of first marching on Rome shattered all moral barriers. If his enemy could do it, why couldn't he respond in kind? Violence beget violence, starting the flywheel of civil war. And finally, the fifth, deepest layer, existential. Humiliation. The flight, the exile, the threat of death, sitting on the ruins of Carthage, all of this broke him. The hero died in the swamps of Minturnae, and a vengeful old man returned from Africa, for whom neither Rome nor the Republic existed any longer. There was only one goal: to make his enemies pay for his suffering. He saved the physical body of Rome from the Cimbri and Teutones, but his every action aimed at his own self-aggrandizement, struck a blow against the mos maiorum, the soul, the unwritten laws and traditions that held the Republic together. He saved the walls, but he destroyed the foundation. And when the foundation crumbled, the very walls he had saved collapsed, burying his enemies and himself beneath them. The story of Gaius Marius is not just one man's biography. It is an eternal, universal parable about the nature of power and the price a society pays for its own salvation. It asks a fundamental question. What is more dangerous to a state? The foreign enemy at the gates, or the Savior to whom we grant limitless power to defeat that enemy? Rome, terrified to death by the barbarian threat, broke its own laws 5 times in a row, handing supreme power to the same man. It created a cult of personality, an indispensable leader, the nation's only hope. And in doing so, it placed that man above the law. Marius grew accustomed to the idea that the rules did not apply to him, that his will was the highest law, because he was the Savior. And when the system tried to bring him back into the fold, he saw it not as a restoration of order, but as a personal betrayal and an insult. He could not go back to being an ordinary citizen after he had been a deity. This story is a tragedy not only of Marius, but of Rome itself, which, in its desperation, gave birth to a monster. It teaches us that the most dangerous tyrants are often born from the most celebrated heroes. When a society is willing to sacrifice its principles and laws for the sake of security, it opens the door for those who, having saved it from an external threat, will just as easily enslave it from within. Gaius Marius was not an evil man from the start. He was a product of his time and his ambition. But the path he walked, from an unknown youth from Arpinum to the savior of Rome, and finally to its bloody executioner, serves as an eternal reminder that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions and great victories, and that sometimes the most terrible thing that can happen to a city is to be saved one too many times by the same man.